Welcome back to Darktown. Population unknown but decreasing with every passing story. Tonight we take another journey together through this ostensibly normal, everyday American Midwest city. In our first destination in Darktown this evening, a struggling young wanderer is caught in a deadly snowstorm and finds shelter in a remote house with an enigmatic, brooding roommate. Gabe, a battle-scarred veteran with a mysterious past, offers warmth and safety, but something isn't right. As the storm rages outside, pale shadows flicker just beyond sight, and long-buried fears resurface. 12 Days of Snow by Luminaria. It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink, and listen. Day 1. It was cold, though I guess that's to be expected when you're walking in the middle of a snowstorm. I was almost knees deep in a carpet of white. In hindsight, it was a dumb idea to be outside in this kind of weather, but in my defense, it wasn't this cold when I started my trip. It all just fell too quick. White fog escaped my mouth when I breathed, and I squinted through it to look down at my watch, raising it closer to my face. The needles had stopped moving at some points. It broke. Figures. I hunched further inside my jacket and tried to pull my sleeves further over my fingers before they froze. A pale shadow moved in my peripheral vision. I turned to look, but no one was there. Just snow falling and wind rustling. I sighed. My chest felt tight when the memories flooded back in. I can't recall the first time I saw those things. They've been around since I was a little kid. I knew they weren't real. Monsters don't exist. And the meds took the visions away, or used to. I couldn't pay for that sort of medicine while working at a cafe. Funny thing how the anxiety and hallucinations had been fine for my parents to deal with. Therapy, controlled meds, and hospital visits were fine too. But just me being me was past the limit. I was suddenly too much for them. Too much. Not that I was complaining. Jake had been a real bro to find this place for me when he found out my folks had kicked me out. Jake is a bro in general, the only co-worker who didn't mind switching shifts at times or cleaning the walk-in freezer, but, well, I digress. The advertisement was from some guy looking for a roommate to split house chores and rent, which was already crazy cheap, well, probably because the place was in the middle of nowhere, and the signal in the area was piss poor at best. But, hey, better having a roof than not. And just the thought of a heater already felt like a blessing. I could see the lights on the porch ahead already, but it seemed like an eternity passed before I reached it and pressed the doorbell. Nothing. The minutes stretched while I waited, breathing into my palms in an attempt to warm them up. I pressed the doorbell again. Nothing. There was nobody home. Oh crap, I was freezing here. What are you doing out there, kiddo? I lifted my head to see a man standing at the doorstep in a plain white t-shirt and jeans, lean frame, curly platinum white hair and ice blue eyes, eyebrows creased in a confused frown. I stared. He stared back. We held a staring contest for about 5 seconds before I managed to introduce myself. He ushered me inside and cranked the heating up until my teeth stopped chattering, which I was thankful for. And that's how I met Gabe. From the way he spoke, I assumed he was around my dad's age, though, judging by looks alone, I'd have believed it if someone had told me he was 25. He was one of those people who aged annoyingly well, I guess. He looked, for all intents and purposes, like a Greek statue had escaped the museum and was now walking around. Well, sort of walking if you ignore the crutches. Gabe was a veteran. I'm not sure about the details, but war did a number on his legs. He could still get around on his own, but he was slow and couldn't stand for long periods. The part on that ad about splitting house chores started making more sense then, other than, just being a common courtesy. You can have the room upstairs. Got any luggage? No, just my backpack. Okay, make yourself at home. There's food in the fridge, but fair warning, I'm a vegetarian, so if you want meat, you go get it and cook it yourself. Day 2. The house was like a small two-story cottage furnished in vintage style. There were antiques everywhere, or at least dupes good enough for my untrained eye not to notice the difference. There was even a corded phone in the living room, those with the twirly cable and numbers in a turning disc instead of on a keyboard. There were electrical sockets, no issue, so at least I wouldn't have to worry about keeping my phone charged. But the snowstorm outside was doing its thing, and I wasn't getting a signal, neither cell phone nor Wi-Fi. Sadly, that meant ordering a pizza was out of the question. We had eggs and toast for breakfast, where I was pleasantly surprised to find a large assortment of jams in the cupboard, and pasta with an extremely cheesy sauce for lunch. Not the lot of healthy veggies and salads I'd been expecting, but hey, if food was going to be like that every meal, I wasn't going to complain. On the lower floor was the landing and living room, a little kitchen and dining room blended space, a bathroom, an office, and Gabe's room. Upstairs was my room, another larger bathroom, and a little atrium, sunroom of sorts. Everything felt old, but in a lived-in way rather than the sunroom, which I had to dust off and sweep. Well, it made sense. It was pretty cold with the current weather, and Gabe mostly stayed downstairs, either watching the old TV in the living room, reading or painting in his office. His office smelled of ink and turpentine, and was cluttered with more books, strewn papers, frames, and canvases than should have fitted in the small room. It was hard to even walk in without tripping on something. The books were all over the place and didn't seem to follow any specific theme or language. A bunch of them I couldn't read, not even the title, but it was the paintings that were the stars of the room. Do you, sell those for a living? Nah, it's just a hobby. Gets boring here pretty fast otherwise. Well, if you ever felt like selling the paintings, they might bring in some good cash. I wasn't an artist by any means, but even I could see that they were stunning. The depth and perspective of everything, the way the sun and shade in the images felt so real. For some of them, I had to look really close to notice the brushstrokes and make sure they weren't actually pictures taken with a camera. There were flowers and still life, wide landscapes, idyllic scenes, and people partying. Hey, got any favorites, kiddo? My eyes wandered around until settling on a painting the size of a sheet of printer paper framed on the back wall. A dainty girl in a summer dress and with long wavy hair stood beneath a large tree, peeling some sort of fruit, while a pair of children sat nearby, I assumed waiting for the snacks to be handed out. While the full picture was great, it was obvious that a lot more care and effort had been put on the girl than on everything else. That's your girlfriend? I teased. My little sister, he simply said and shrugged. Or, how I remember her as. I haven't seen her in ages. Oh. Now that was awkward. You look alike. I'll take that as a compliment, thanks, he snickered. I wasn't fully sure on how my life would keep unfolding from then on, but at least now the uncertainty wasn't as suffocating as before. For now, I liked the house, and I liked Gabe. I went to bed feeling light and hopeful, and paid no heed to the shadows flickering outside. Day 6. I woke up to a light tapping sound, repeating non-stop. I didn't know if it was too early or just the weather making the sky darker than it was supposed to be. The storm still raged on, snow falling and dulling the sounds outside, till everything felt strangely empty. I begrudgingly opened my eyes and stood up, wondering if there was a rat or some bug scurrying around. There was a face on my window, and hands gripping the sill from the outside. My heart kind of skipped a beat. I rubbed the sand off my eyes and looked again. Well, there was no one there, of course. I breathed a sigh of relief, changing clothes and heading to the bathroom to wash my face and brush my hair. I forgot the hairbrush, so I had to turn back again. And then, the face was there, cheeks and fingers patting against the window. Crackly grey skin and a mouth with too many teeth. You're not real. I'm seeing things. I'm just seeing things, I told myself, pressing my palms against the window, trying to gather some speck of rationality my frayed nerves hadn't destroyed yet. Well, the glass felt cold and solid, a safe barrier between me and... the face slammed itself against the window with a dull thud. I screamed. Gabe made his way up the stairs after a while. I'm not sure how long. When he got there, I was curled into a ball in the corner, still screaming and crying. Couldn't stop. Just... that thing. That dead-looking thing. Oh, just take it away. It's okay, kiddo. It's okay now. You just breathe. I forced myself to blink. There was nothing on my window. Of course there wasn't. This was the second floor. But that face. An ashen grey face with a rusty, deformed metal plate covering half of it. Its breath fogged the window, its discoloured cheeks and fingers making low, disconcerting noises as they were rubbed against the glass pane. Sad. Old. Broken. That face was printed in my mind now. I could still see it when I closed my eyes. It felt so real, but it wasn't real. I mean, it couldn't be. God, I was going crazy. Gabe guided me into sitting down on the bed and taking deep, slow breaths, then sat down with me while I tried to focus. I was trying to regain control of my own lungs and organize my thoughts into a more coherent stream. Air in, air out, rinse and repeat. It took a couple of minutes until I was breathing more or less normally, but I still couldn't stop shaking. Gabe theorized that giving me a sugar boost might help, so we moved to the kitchen, and I sat down with a bag of ice pressed to my head while he whipped up a plate of syrupy pancakes for me. Thanks, Gabe. You're an angel. And you're a human, he snorted and patted my back. Just eat your pancakes. I did, or I nibbled the pancakes at least. They tasted good, but I just couldn't muster much of an appetite. Hey, why did you join the war? I asked. Why that question now? You don't strike me as the sort of guy who'd ever wield a gun. Why'd you do it? He said there wasn't a set reason. I could ask 10 of them why they went to the war, and I'd get 10 different answers. Some fought for freedom, a better future, or to protect others. Some fought to gain something, or because they were pressured to, or they felt like they had no choice. Some even fought just because everyone else was fighting too, so why not? My reason? None. I wasn't thinking at all. And he shook his head. My kid was murdered. One day he was out with friends, healthy and happy. Next he was dead and his face was covered in blood. That's what made me join really, really late. I just saw red and I wanted each and every one of them to suffer and die. He sighed. There was no kind word or talk of forgiveness that I'd listen to. You know what? No matter how many fell, it didn't make me feel better. No rest for the wicked, right? He chuckled, and it was the most bitter and sad sound I'd ever heard. Oh, I'm still angry, kiddo. Think I always will be. I just got tired, too. And so that was it. He lost his little boy, and then he just lost it. No honorable ideal, no nothing. Just violent and all-encompassing grief. I didn't know if that was something that should be forgiven or not, and I sure didn't ask him. I just ate my pancakes and let him keep patting my back. And I realized I wasn't shaking anymore. Day 12. Morning came with more snow, and I was starting to wonder if it would ever stop. It had been piling up for almost 2 weeks now, since the first day I'd arrived, like it was trying to gobble me up along with the whole house. We still had food for the time being, but it was starting to worry me seriously. Neither I nor Gabe had a car, and I couldn't see another house or any neighbors in the area. For how long would we be stranded in that building? Gabe told me to take it easy, mainly after what had happened the previous week. And I knew just worrying over it wasn't going to solve anything. But I was growing more and more anxious anyway, and that wasn't even mentioning the risk of me being fired because I couldn't possibly get to work. God, I prayed I wouldn't get fired. At that rate, staying inside was going to drive me crazy, so I laid up as best I could and stepped outside, deciding I could at least do something productive and shovel the snow out of the porch. I figured that if it got too cold, I'd just go back inside, no harm done. Boy, was I wrong. A few minutes after I stepped outside, I could swear I saw something moving in the corners of my field of view. Then I turned, and there was nothing there. It was all in my head. I was getting worse, and that thought terrified me. There's no way I could pay for antipsychotics or therapy out of my own pockets. My current roommate was nice, but I only knew the guy for 2 weeks. What if I had another breakdown and he decided he didn't want to deal with me anymore? What would happen to me? Well, I had to hang in there. I needed to. A low rumble echoed from somewhere around, far away. I huffed, angrily dusting snow off the porch with both a shovel and my own shoes, and scraping the frost off the little ornamental fence, frustrated with myself. Something moved in my peripheral vision again. I squinted, straining my eyes and peering across the white horizon, and I waited, trying to convince myself there wasn't anything out there, because there shouldn't be. There was no one, nothing in that storm besides wild wind and frozen water. I was about to shove the last bit of snow off and call it a day when I saw them standing out there, by the edge of the yard, the faintest outlines of people. There were 3 of them, pale and immobile, partially camouflaged by the scenery's natural colour scheme. What now? I mumbled, momentarily forgetting my shovel. There weren't any people out in the storm besides me. That was the very problem I was facing, even with no one else living in that vicinity and no signal to contact civilization outside. What crazy stuff was my fried nincompoop brain trying to concoct this time? "Hello?" I called out loud. "Gabe, can you come out for a minute and check this out?" Yeah, I'm an idiot, so sue me. Oh, please don't. At least I still had half a mind to also ask her for a second opinion from someone who's probably not crazy. Except the guy was also one of the slowest walkers on the planet, so I was going to be waiting there for a while. I craned my neck and squinted once more, holding one hand cupped around my face to help me see and willing my eyes to either confirm or deny the humanoid figures standing at the very edge of my sight. Well, they were there. One seemed smaller than the other two, but I couldn't tell for sure. A child, or was it just farther away? Well, either way, they were starting to move now, staggering slightly in the snow. Maybe there really were people in there, freezing, like I'd been 2 weeks before. "Hey, you all right? Do you need help?" I called out to them. I was shouting, and even though the calling left my own lungs, I could barely hear it above the raging wind. That's my luck, I guessed. I shoveled the snow off the first couple of steps from the porch, trying to open up a path while they waddled past the yard edge. And then I bumped into something. One of the figures was suddenly beside me, and I smashed directly into it, almost sending myself cartwheeling in the snow. But instead I found myself on my knees, looking up at a shape far too tall and grey to be a living human. He stood at least 7 feet tall, in a wispy ash-grey cloak and half-molten pieces of armour, giving it the appearance of restraints rather than protection. A loop of bone adorned its head like a bizarre crown. The thing also wore a mask, or a broken helmet made of metal. Its breath echoed weirdly through the slits, and I could imagine an abnormal amount of eyes leering at me through the shadows of its face cover. Close. Too close. His fingers were almost touching me. "Oh, come on," I groaned, picking my shovel back up, and angrily started shoveling the last remnants of snow off the pathway, chiding my own brain. Couldn't even be creative. Of course I couldn't. Always the same big, lanky, creepy shit. Well, newsflash for you, you defective organ living rent-free in my skull. I already know it's not real. It doesn't exist. It shoved its hand into my chest, solid and pointy, sharp fingers sinking past the ribcage. I sputtered, pain flaring through me so intense that I froze, twitching against the creature's hand. And the weirdest part is, I wasn't bleeding. It's like the thing's fingers just passed through. Not as in an illusion or ghost passing through. No, it's as if my body was made of water and this monster ruptured that water's surface, and its fingers were now swimming inside me. I gasped and sputtered more, trying to pry it away, but it was stronger than me. They were stronger than me. The thing swarmed me, pinning me down and straddling my body, my arms pinned to my sides by grey, spindly limbs. It was like being sat on by a giant ice sculpture, by Edward Scissorhands or an ungodly blend of both. It was so cold it burned, so much I couldn't even scream. I thought the pain couldn't get any worse until it found whatever it was they were searching for in my chest and tugged it half out. It was pure, unbridled agony. Worse than if it had ripped my heart out. There was some sort of golden ball of light, its glow spilling to illuminate the porch like a weird garden lamp. It tore chunks off the light and brought them to its mouth. Christ, it was eating me. It hurts. It hurts. Oh my God, it hurts. Brother. It spoke? Someone was shouting. I turned my head slightly, trying to see what caught the thing's attention. There was Gabe, braced against the wall on the landing, flailing his crutches at the things atop me, like he was telling kids to get off his lawn. This is my domain, he started, stepping out of the house. This is my porch. Something made a weird breaking sound as he approached. It took me a second to realize it was one of the crutches, slammed against one of the creature's heads and sending it rearing into the snow. The crutch's thin wooden exterior splintered, revealing something sharp that glistened below. And this is my kid. I found him. He's mine now. You'll not have this one. I had the thought before that he didn't look like the sort of guy who'd wield a gun. And I was right. The thin twin longsword suited him a lot better, as weird as that was. His voice was starting to ring in my ears, though, distorting and echoing, like that thing's voice did. By the authority granted me hither, be gone or I'll splatter those bloody, corrupted heads of yours into smithereens, smaller than the fall itself could. The creature rose back from the snow, looking slightly disoriented, and then they all pounced at Gabe. Something in the back of my mind told me not to look, and I closed my eyes. But even through clenched eyelids and remaining prone on the ground, I could still feel a flare of light. The monsters instantly cleared away as waves of cold and heat washed over me. The noise hurt my ears, and something wet and warm started running from them and from my nose. It smelled like iron. Metal clashed against metal. I had no idea what was going on. It just hurt. It was hard to breathe. I kept my eyes closed and tried to focus on breathing despite the pain. Gabe had gone silent, but I could hear the creatures screaming weird words and curses. Something about hordes of light and betrayal and fruits. They screamed and screamed and screamed, and then, one by one, their screams became gurgling, and it all finally stopped. Still with me, kiddo? Gabe's voice asked, no longer ringing like before. Cough if you're conscious. I coughed. Okay, good. Let's get you back inside. A pair of hands slid under my armpits and dragged me back into the house. He took me into his office, placing me belly up on the couch before staggering to sit on the armrest behind my head. A dull clang told me he'd dropped his crutches, swords, onto the floor nearby. What? I coughed again. What were those things? The unnamed. 2 Grigori and a cherub, if you want to be specific. Unnamed what? They're angels from the lower-rank legions who were never given individual names. They lost their light in the fall and keep trying to get it back by eating others, which doesn't work, by the way. Gabe sighed. You can open your eyes. It's safe now. I forced my eyes open, fighting against the blurriness in my vision. Something wet and cold was dripping onto my wound. Drip. Drip. Gabe mumbled to himself, groaning in frustration. I don't understand. This is what she did. Am I doing something wrong? Black. His blood was black. His hand was raised above the ball of light still on my chest. His palm was bleeding, a thick tar-colored liquid oozing from it and onto the light. Drip, drip, drip. For some reason I couldn't understand, the black drops that fell onto the light sizzled and started shining along, and as the gold glow slowly got brindled with silver, the searing pain in my chest started to dull a little bit. Gabe? Right here, kiddo. He smiled. Gabe, I gasped. Am I dying? You're not. He ruffled my hair with his other hand. Souls are infinite. They can't be destroyed. Then why does it hurt? His face scrunched up, somewhere between a grimace and a wince. Well, they can't be destroyed, but they can be torn. I stared at the silver glow, soft and dim compared to the gold. A blank filling patchworked like scar tissue. There was a piece of me that wasn't there anymore. My identity, likes and dislikes, memories. It was hurting because there was a gap in me. Gabe was filling it back up, but he wasn't me, and he couldn't give me what he didn't have. He couldn't replace what was taken from me exactly as it was before. All the while he kept asking me a lot of things, random things. My age and blood type, my favorite color, the name of my childhood dog. I didn't have a dog. My opinion on carrots, and so on. He made me retell everything I've told here. Why I'd needed to move, and how I found his house. Hey, what's your name? Nothing left my mouth. I couldn't remember. I knew Gabe, and I told him what I was called when we introduced ourselves to each other, but I couldn't remember my own freaking name. Your name's Taylor. He sighed and patted me on the head. Why are you here? Because I couldn't stay at my folks' place anymore. Well, they didn't take me coming out well, so I had to find somewhere cheap. A friend at work found out I was looking for a place to move and showed me an ad of someone looking for a roommate. He told me to go check it out. Oh, good. And then? As I was going to, Dad popped up at the end of my shift after everyone left. Said he wanted to talk. He was so drunk. And after, I told him to leave. Said it was closing time and I had to go. He started yelling at me. I yelled back. He shoved me and I stumbled into the freezer. And the door closed and it was so cold my breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't remember getting out, only walking and walking. It was so cold and I was freezing. I reached a porch and Gabe opened the front door. I, already died, didn't I? He took a long while to respond. I watched him just staring out of the window into the never-ending snowstorm outside, brows furrowed like he was weighing his options. Wonder what he was thinking. Could have kept me at his place forever, watching TV, complaining of the weather, and eating meals together. A feeble substitute to the family he'd lost. But he didn't force me to stay. You're not dead yet, he finally said, and let out a long breath. You're in the realm Adam and Eve were expelled from, where my kind has dwelt since before the War of Heaven. It's a place all souls return to when they die, either attracted towards their assigned guardian's domain or guided here by them. But one doesn't need to be dead to come here. Humans with Nephilim ancestry, oracles, mediums and astral projectors, or whatever you call them nowadays, they have the ability to walk or at least peek into here to some degree. Others can reach this place through occult rituals or crossing thresholds in places where the boundaries are blurry. But there are cases, like yours, when a body just gets so damaged they're almost dead. Almost, but not quite. So the soul wanders out until your body is fit enough to house you again. Problem is, the longer you stay out or interact with anyone here, the harder it is for you to go back. Your connections to the other side fray. So, you better get going soon. Wait, so, you're my guardian angel? He shook his head. "Well, I've not taken in any children since Yeshua died. I'm not sure why you came to me. Maybe your actual guardian is dead, or maybe your soul was still unclaimed. You just got here by chance." He huffed and then shrugged and gave the tiniest of smiles. "Well, either way, I'm glad you got here. You've made the house feel like a home for a little while." I felt like crying again. Heck, I did cry again. No shame about that. It started with a sob, and soon I was bawling and didn't stop for a while. I wish my parents had told me that too, that they were happy to have me. They probably never would, I knew, but someone else did, and the amount of relief I felt almost made my heart explode. "You need to get back to your body, kiddo," he said, after giving me a moment to calm down. "And how do I do that?" I asked. "Do I just have to wake up somehow?" Gabe grimaced again. "If you don't know the way, I have to send you back. But I've been trying to since you got here. I don't understand why it's not working. What is it I'm missing?" He trailed off, his gaze shifting to stare at the painting across the room. "It has to work both ways." He speed-walked across towards the painting, faster than I'd seen him move ever before. There was an awful noise of ceramic cracking when he did. So I guess he could run when he wanted to. It looked painful, and his steps left bloody, blackish footprints in his wake. I had to suppress a second-hand wince on his behalf. He took the painting from the wall, out of its frame, and into an envelope along with a note he hastily scribbled. "The deal's a trade between two parts, so it won't work if it's one-sided. I do something for you that you couldn't do alone. You do something for me that I couldn't do." I had no idea what he was rambling on about. I wasn't even in the right realm of existence, for heaven's sake. What could I possibly do for him that he couldn't? "Taylor." The sound of my own name again made me feel dazed. "Do you want to go back?" I nodded. "I need to send this parcel. Can you deliver it for me?" I nodded again and suddenly felt very sleepy. I think I remember him smiling with relief and nodding back at me, but not sure if he really did or if I was just dozing off. And everything faded into a blur of white. I woke up to the bright fluorescent lights of a hospital room, with an IV attached to my arm and half lulled, half risen by the beeping of medical machinery. They said I was in that walk-in fridge for 12 hours, between the time when my shift ended and when someone found me at the start of the morning shift and called an ambulance. 12 hours, in contrast to the 12 days I'd spent at Gabe's place. It was a miracle I was alive and didn't lose any body parts due to frostbite. I heard at first that the hospital had intended to contact my parents, but the police had gotten involved. And once the camera footage at my work was reviewed and they saw my dad, well, you can guess. So the doctors contacted my grandparents instead. It's weird to think of it. They were iffy about me before, too, thinking I was just going through a difficult phase and needed to snap out of it, and so on, but when they heard I'd almost died, they ran straight to see me. I've moved in with them. Well, they're old, so there's a lot of things that they still don't get, but they're trying to learn and are being supportive. It's made me cry like a fountain a couple of times by now, but in a nice way. I think I've become an official crybaby, but who cares? Well, that was all back in November. Been seeing a therapist since then. She's nice, though I'm pretty sure she doesn't believe me when I told her about Gabe. Heck, I don't think I'd believe it either if I heard it from someone else. I only know that it was real and not just a trauma-induced hallucination, because I still have his letter. The envelope was on the nightstand when I woke up in the hospital, tucked inside my backpack along with the rest of my stuff. It wasn't sealed shut, so I've looked through it a couple of times. There's the painting, just as I remembered, and a letter. I can't read the letter. I don't understand the language at all. The words are not in any alphabet I can recognize, and I start getting migraines when I look at them for too long. There's only one thing I can read. The 2 words inscribed on the outside of the envelope. Probably so I'd know who would receive it. To Lucy. Well, there's no address to mail it to anywhere. Maybe I was supposed to just know where to go, and there are times when it feels like I do. Sometimes I'm walking home from work or just taking a stroll, and I feel like taking a detour somewhere strange for no reason. To skip off the trail while hiking and head into the woods or into some dark alleyway I can't see the end of. Shaded corners, dark corridors, liminal spaces. All the times it's happened, I willed some sense back into myself and went home. Yeah, the unnamed angels are one reason, but I also don't want to get mugged, you know. But it's gotten to the point past just curiosity. It became an almost unavoidable compulsion. Last week I zoned out while washing dishes after dinner, and when I came to, it was 1 a.m. and I was stepping into the yard of some abandoned building on the other side of town. It's not that I don't want to fulfill my promise to Gabe. He helped me, he saved me. I owe him that much. Even if I didn't, I don't know how much longer I can delay it anyway. The new year's approaching, and the whole world will be at a threshold. I guess I just wanted someone to know what really happened. I've queued this to be posted automatically on January 1st. Well, hopefully I'll still be here to catch it and add a little edit like, "Hey, I survived," or similar afterward, and just laugh at how silly I was being. But I'm scared. When I get wherever this deal is leading me to, Gabe won't be there to help or to send me back. And if that was really Gabriel, as in the Archangel Gabriel, then I can guess also who Lucy is. I don't think I'll make it back again.
Well, as we know, in Darktown, horrors come in many forms. For a young child, abuse at the hands of a trusted family member was the first chapter of a life marked by darkness. While the true nightmare began later, long after the family fled to America to escape the past. One restless night, a glowing light from the forbidden shed behind the house drew our protagonist inside. What they found inside wasn't just horrifying, it shattered every sense of safety that they thought they had left. A secret too grotesque to imagine, and a revelation that turned their world upside down.
Endless by Rayne. Horror is subjective, there's no denying that. I've told my story to others over the years, to which some have claimed that it was no more than a sob story, dressed up as horror. Oh, as I said, it's subjective. Were I to tell you of the molestation my father's brother forced upon me before I was old enough for my mind to even be able to rationalize it, I would imagine this would not quite qualify as horrific to some. Well, to me it most certainly was, but to a reader perhaps not quite. Of course, this is only the beginning of my tale. My childhood home was located in a small town on the outskirts of London. When my father, who was not expected to return to the house for many hours, as he was attending a very important business meeting in the city, arrived back home, just in time to witness my uncle's abuse firsthand, well, I bore witness to a very different brand of horror, one far more akin to the more traditional expectations of the genre, I'd think. Though he used no more than his bare hands to subdue his older brother, there was very little left in the man by the time my father summoned the authorities to our home. The police were remarkably understanding about the actions of my father, so he would face no prison time for leaving my uncle bound to a hospital bed for many months, though the events which played out before my eyes left quite a strain on my already troubled soul. Though tears filled my eyes due to what my uncle had forced upon me, I can still clearly see the pounding of my father's fists splashing scarlet streams across the walls. Yes, I could describe to you in vivid detail the swollen and splitting flesh of my abuser's face, tearing away in grizzled chunks as my father waged his rage-fueled assault. But that would be far more gratuitous than necessary. Again, perhaps more to the liking of those for a more expected horror story, but still unnecessary. Only months after that day, we fled the country, with my parents hopeful that I could push these memories away into the black. We relocated to the States, where my mother and father would go on to find more lucrative employment than they'd previously achieved. My father was something of a businessman, though I cannot tell you much more than that, as I cared little for such things in my youth. My mother was a teacher, finding a place amongst the faculty of a well-respected college just outside of the town in which we lived. I will neither include the name of the school nor the city in question, for reasons you may understand quite soon. I was nearing 12 when I awoke in the middle of the night due to the nightmares which still haunted me in the dark, while I lay still behind the protective comfort of my closed eyelids. As I sat up straight in my bed, still reeling from the distorted memories of the troubled times gone by, I noticed the light beaming from the red-painted shed which rested behind my home, through the window parallel to my bed. Though the terrors of my youth left me skittish and weary of just about everything, I was also overburdened with a growing curiosity for anything that struck my mind to be of interest, and as such I took it upon myself to investigate the small wooden building my parents would keep hidden from me behind a large metal padlock. I crept down the stairs in hopes of not alerting my guardians to my late-night curiosities. I slowly flipped the locks of the back door before gently turning the knob to grant me entry to the outside world. As I drew closer to the shed, I heard sounds both familiar and foreign to me, along with almost unnaturally muffled voices. The dark curtains covering the windows allowed me no way of seeing through, only the light which shone from behind them and around them. It would seem, should I hope to quench the thirst of my curious mind, that I would have little choice but to enter. The lock had been removed from the clasp which splayed open beside the door, leading me to believe it had either been left this way by my parents, or by someone forcing their way into the wooden building. Though my skin trembled, both with anticipation and fear in equal amounts, I reached a shaky hand to the latch of the simple door. As I slowly turned the handle, pulling the door ajar, I felt my jaw hang wide, while the blood drained from the upper half of my body. The young woman whom I'd never before laid eyes on was strapped to a long table with her right arm and both thighs bound by thick leather straps. She feebly moaned through the rag which had seemingly been forced into her mouth, while my father sliced through her flesh before me. He hadn't noticed my arrival, as he appeared fully consumed by the task at hand. He wore blue denim overalls, which were spattered with both dried and fresh specks of crimson and ruby red stains. The blade within his grasp was long and jagged, causing sounds not unlike the tearing of thick fabric while he sawed into her. Her movements were only subtle, as there was very little holding her together into one solid structure anymore, and I had to believe her suffering had almost come to a close. There were deep gashes all over her, along with wide and grizzled open holes where clumps of flesh and muscle once sat in place, now layering the plastic-lined floor. Both of her legs had been removed below the knee, while my father worked on separating her left arm at the shoulder. As the bone and tissue finally gave way, I audibly gasped as the arm fell to meet the discarded legs and meaty shrapnel on the floor. When my father turned to face me with streams of scarlet across his face, his own jaw fell wide upon meeting my trembling gaze. He dropped his blood-soaked blade to the floor while slowly pacing towards me with his arms outstretched and his eyes wide and glassy. I hadn't even realized that the burgeoning scream which bellowed out from within me had already been lurking in my throat in preparation for its release. As I fled from the man who now softly called my name into the night, my wailing yells awoke an array of sounds through the sporadic neighborhood in which my home was located. Though the other houses were many yards apart from one another, some of their inhabitants creaked open their doors as I ran flailing through the chilly night air. My father, still in pursuit and still clothed in his blood-stained garments, came to a halt as an elderly man wrapped his arms around me, lifting me from the center line of the two-lane road which ran between the scattered buildings. My father stopped in place, gazing into the eyes of the man who held me. The hours that followed faded into a blur before me. Once more the authorities arrived at the home I shared with my loving parents, but this time to transport the one who saved me from my uncle's ravagings to a far less than enviable and uncertain future. The investigation and subsequent trial which followed did not last long, as my father took little time in confessing to all 17 of the lives he'd taken, even those he'd ended before our trip across the Atlantic. How many years he'd been feeding his impulses this way, I cannot say, but it was a truly devastating revelation to my mother and me, along with many more who'd grown to respect him over the years. Before his trial resulted in an impending death sentence, The denizens of the small city in which we lived had already begun to wage a war fueled by fear and hatred against my mother and me. Though my father had proved to be quite the wretched individual, his more legal ventures over the years had left us a great deal of financial stability. This would enable us to make our way to another town, one far away from those who considered us to be as guilty as my father. As the years progressed, the word of my father's foul deeds reached our new home, garnering my mother and I another assault of hatred and mockery, ultimately leading to me witnessing yet another gruesome sight upon opening a door. The shotgun my mother used to end her life had left very little of her head intact, which was the very first thing that greeted me on my arrival back home after school ended that day, only weeks before my 15th birthday. I can't exactly say how long I stood there, under the frame of that splayed open entryway. I was still in a daze when I reached for the phone to beckon one more visit from the authorities. Their interrogations lasted for hours, during which I was only vaguely coherent. I even found myself locked away in my own cell for a time, though mine was lined with padded walls, as opposed to the metal bars which held my father in place, until the electricity would course through his body. I didn't find myself relocated to that dismal place at first, though. It wasn't until I made my own efforts to put a permanent end to the memories which plagued me that I was bound in a buckled jacket and led to the place which would serve as my home for some years. While my mother had dramatically taken her life by blasting her head into little more than scattered fragments of bloodied skull, I merely sliced through the veins which lay beneath the flesh of my wrists. I vividly remember fading away into the black, before I found my eyelids springing back open, with my body strapped to the rolling gurney. For some years I remained in that room, before I was considered fit to live among the free. My time spent there allowed me the opportunity to mend my weary mind and troubled thoughts to a point, though I cannot claim I am not still haunted by the events which put my childhood to rest. I can honestly say that the doctors who treated me during my stay in this secluded facility did manage to break me free from the protective shell I'd forged around myself, though I may not have been as mentally sound as I led them to believe. Still, had it not been for their intervention, I would surely have made further efforts to end my suffering far sooner. Once I was permitted to leave the institution, I was finally ready to make my own way in this world. I was nearing 19 years of age, so I'd be able to claim what remained of my father's fortune. My mother had apparently put a great deal of planning into her departure from this world, having transferred her accounts into one under my name. Though our cross-country relocation, along with the subsequent years she and I had spent attempting to hide from my father's legacy, had somewhat depleted them, there was still more than enough for me to make my way back to my home country, while affording me my own house upon arrival. Though I was unsure if the tales of my father's nefarious actions would follow me back to the town I was born in, I made sure to legally change my name in hopes of avoiding any association with the man. Given the fact that I was unsure of exactly when my father had begun feeding his impulses, I did not wish to carry his surname back to a place where it may be all too familiar. Though life progressed far less chaotically than my childhood years had, I cannot claim that I was particularly content. Yes, I was financially stable, but I couldn't quite find my place in this world. Now I have little doubt that any of you who may still be reading these words will consider anything I've shared to be especially horrific. Yes, I have witnessed more than my share of mangled husks of human flesh and bone, far more so than the average person, I would think. But does this qualify my tale to be one of horrors? Perhaps not. We all have our share of demons lurking in the dark corners of our rooms and homes. We all have experienced troubling times, during which we could never conceive of a world in which we did not suffer. I'm sure many of you have witnessed far more horrendous sights than those I've described through these handfuls of paragraphs. I do not doubt that there are far greater threats hiding away, just to the side of where we're looking. Still, my story has not come to a close just yet. As the years continued to trickle by, I found myself growing more and more devoid of emotion. My mornings would each share a similar battle, during which I would consider whether or not it would be worth my time to break free from my warm bed, to face the outside world once more. Though I would inevitably emerge from within the safety of my blankets, I lacked the drive to do anything productive with my time. I considered seeking employment, though I had little in the way of skills or experience to garner much interest from prospective employers. After weeks turned to months, I began to find my old friend, despair, wrapping its tendrils around me once more. My second effort to end my suffering was far less dramatic than the first, involving little more than a bottle of pills I'd purchased from a stranger who beckoned to me from a street corner one rainy evening. Within only minutes of my ingesting the 20 or so little green pills, my head felt almost blissfully loopy and light. Moments later, I felt my body droop, growing weaker and more disconnected from my brain by the second. I can't speak as to how much time passed by before the world spun around me, causing me to feel almost weightless as my senses were consumed by the black once more. And for that brief moment, as I careened into glorious darkness, I felt more free and filled with glee than I'd ever known. And as with all of the fleeting moments of joy my life had shown me, this too was to be short-lived. With my eyes blinked back to awareness, I lay still on my comfortable bed, momentarily confused by the events which had led me there. Though I fully recalled my purchase of the bottle of little green pills, I could find absolutely no evidence they'd ever existed. I patrolled the area at which I'd been beckoned by the stranger, to find as little trace of him as the bottle which I knew to have fallen from my fingertips as life drained out of me. Could this series of events have been no more than a manifestation from my subconscious mind while I slept? Perhaps to convince me that this was not the answer to all that ails me? I could find no other rationalization, leaving me little choice but to continue plundering through the daily life I'd grown to detest. It would be the following year before I came to face my inevitable end for a third time, though it would not be delivered by my own hands, but by a large SUV that careened through the crosswalk I was making my way across. I was not alone as I traversed the busy streets of London that day, accompanied by many strangers across the striped lines dividing the traffic on either side. I have quite a remarkable memory. I'll not use such words as photographic or eidetic or anything so grandiose, but I can recall many things in vivid detail. I can still feel the sensation of my skull cracking across the windshield of the tall, blue-colored vehicle. When I close my eyes, I can still see the attractive blonde woman falling lifeless next to where I lay, bleeding on the concrete ground. When I awakened the following day, once more under my own warm comforter, I had no doubt this most recent passing from this world was no simple dream. As I lay there dwelling on the troubling life which I desperately craved a release from, I could not help but wonder if I was somehow immune to the powers of death himself. Since I had not fulfilled much schooling through the chaotic events which plagued my youth, perhaps I had not gained enough of a learned experience on why this was such a preposterous concept to consider. It's that very internal argument that led me to seek out further education. Though my father's nest egg still provided anything I may require, I had to consider that this would not carry me much further in life. Where I continued to be unable to seek an end to my pain, I would have little choice but to continue living. My desire to endure life had not gained any momentum, regardless of freeing myself from the torment of my youth, but it would appear I had little choice in the matter. I enrolled myself in a wide array of classes to further my limited education, which I truly enjoyed. My studies finally provided me an escape from the misery I'd allowed to consume me for far too long, while surrounding myself with others, some of whom I would go on to befriend. Those early days were the most difficult, as I'd barely interacted with anyone in many years, outside of the passing relationships formed with those tending the counters of the local shops I would frequent for necessities. I grew quite close to my new friends, Clarence and Rory, over the years I spent attending classes in their company. They would go on to be the only confidants I'd ever known, outside of those who watched over me during my stay in that padded cell so many years before. Rory was the older of us, and something of a philosopher in the way he thought and spoke, though we would often find ourselves chuckling at his more conspiracy-fueled theories of life, the universe, and everything. Clarence was something of a comedian, as well as the athletic one of our humble trio, but we all had common ground in the tragedies which lay our childhoods to rest. I'll not reveal the events which still plagued their troubled minds, as it's not my story to tell, though their respective histories did pave the groundwork for the bonds we formed. After our shared schooling ended, We went on to form a simple web design firm together. It was nothing especially profitable at first, but it allowed us a great deal of freedom in having no strict schedules to meet, depending on what our clients would require at the time, of course. Within a few years, we'd forged quite a decent living through our ventures, and, with my friends by my side, I finally looked forward to what tomorrow may hold. It was a feeling I'd never before known, to no longer seek to end my dreary existence, but to look upon the future with hope. When Eleanor walked through the door of our shared office space on that unusually warm September day, I found yet another reason to feel joy in a world that I had not long since reluctantly chosen to join. She too had not been expecting to find love that day, only to commission our services to build her a website for her own budding venture. Of course, it took me some time and a great deal of encouragement from my friends to gather the courage to suggest that we take things beyond a business relationship. This would also not take place until the said business was behind us, as I would not overstep until the work had reached its end. I could waffle on for hours about her beautiful and beaming smile, twinkling deep brown eyes, glowing dark skin and thick wavy hair, but again, this is not necessary. The only thing of relevance is that I loved her. Perhaps from that very first moment the wind from the open doorway tousled her hair while she fought to control it, accompanied by a genuine giggle. Within 6 months we married, and after another year we were to be parents. We may indeed have rushed things just a bit, but we knew this was real. I had never imagined such happiness could exist in a world that left me begging for the sweet release of death in my youth. Of course, it's during these happier times when we find the ground crumbling beneath our feet. Now, I would imagine whoever may still be reading along at this point may be questioning why a story claiming to be one of horrors would waste so much time touching on the brief moments of happiness. In addition, I would think many of you may find your eyes rolling at what comes next. Yes, everything I've presented you with so far is not particularly difficult to believe, thus lending credence to the idea that this is no horror story. Perhaps this genre is more defined by events that stretch the boundaries of what's real, while blending them more with what cannot be. Still, I do believe I shall have to request that you perhaps take a little bit on faith as I continue, though you surely have no reason to trust my words. There are some who may have more of a clear understanding of the occurrences I'll be sharing soon, though I cannot speak as to whether or not any such person may come to read this. Once my tale has come to a close, I have no doubt that many who may have looked upon these words will think of them as no more than the ramblings of a madman. In truth, I cannot deny this may very well be the case, though I still vividly remember every single detail. Eleanor and I had chosen to spend the weekend in Brighton, as we were both fond of the beach as well as the exemplary museums the city housed. It was mid-August. The sky was almost cloudless, and a more vibrant blue than I'd ever before laid eyes upon. Of course, it could simply be that I hadn't always paid attention to such wonders, as my outlook had always leaned more towards the negative. My lovely wife was still within her initial months of pregnancy, though she'd experienced some weeks of crippling nausea. None of these ailments affected her beautiful glow as we sat upon the pebbled ground with the waves rushing across and between our toes. As we gazed upon one another, my heart still raced ever so slightly, while my stomach nervously tremored. Regardless of how used to her wonderful company I'd grown, I still felt as little more than a stuttering schoolboy when I stared into her glinting eyes. Perhaps it was due to that very affliction that I was not distracted by the alarmed wails of those others we shared the beachfront with at the time. It wasn't until my beautiful wife cut her own glare upwards while allowing her jaw to droop ever so slightly that I took note of the furious, rippling orange which had consumed the vibrant blue of the sky above. I watched in horror as Eleanor's gorgeous face contorted as the terror took hold of her. Within mere moments, the rampaging flame erupted through the sky, almost immediately consuming the buildings which lined the rear of the beach. I wrapped my arms around my love, pulling her deeper into the water in hopes of escaping the certainty of a swift demise, though my actions caused her more suffering than if I'd allowed her to turn to the same pillars of ash which stood in the place of those others that we'd shared the beach with that day. I was forced to bear witness to the skin upon her face, bubbling and splitting as the water around us came to a sudden boil. I looked on in horror as her flesh shrank away, while she squealed out in a sound I will not soon forget, one filled with agonizing horror, as the meaty tissue behind her skin quickly gave way to the reddened bone. I was only vaguely aware of my own body mimicking what I saw before me, until my own eyes swelled and burst from within their sockets. When I awakened in the same bed I'd shared with my loving wife only days before that ill-fated trip, I was certain I'd once again fallen victim to a vivid night terror during my slumber. Though the memories would not fade from behind my eyelids, as any normal flight of fancy the world of dreams may present me with, it was certain to me these events could not have actually transpired, as I looked upon the unscorched land beyond my window. It wasn't until the reality of what had truly occurred hit me that I felt myself spiraling into despair as I had so many times before. Puzzled by the fact that my beloved Eleanor did not lay beside me in our bed, I placed a call to the number I'd committed to memory, as her name no longer greeted me from my list of contacts. The voice which spoke from the receiver was not that of my lovely wife, but of a man who was confused by my inquiry to the location of my love. After my assumption that I'd perhaps misdialed, I placed the call a second time, only to find the same individual on the other end. I quickly grew more frantic while the panic overcame me. I fled from the home in which I knew myself to live with my wife. I sped to the office in time to meet my partners reporting for the day's workload. I practically interrogated the two of them, pleading with them to grant me any knowledge they may have of my wife's whereabouts, though there was no logical reason to assume they would have any answers to give. But they were genuinely puzzled by my inquisition, as they assured me there was no such person, none that they'd ever laid eyes on anyway. As my befuddlement grew, so did my rage. I scorned my friends for the only answers they had to give before I sped away from the office towards the home of my in-laws. Well, after they denied ever parenting a child, as well as having never laid eyes on me, I continued my descent into madness. Days turned to weeks as I plummeted further into despair, once more finding no desire to leave the comfort of the bed I'd once shared with another. I knew she was real. I ached so badly to wake from this nightmare my existence had become again. Eventually, after my own filth and misery had forced me to break free from my self-induced cocoon, I made a meager attempt to clean myself up before walking the streets of the city for hours in an effort to distract me from my broken heart. As my body grew weaker and my feet throbbed from the countless minutes which had trickled by since I began my aimless wandering, I finally gave in to the stabbing in my chest, dropping to my knees in the middle of the crowded sidewalk. I have no way of knowing how long I knelt on the rough concrete, wailing out from the sheer exhausting agony of losing the one thing which had finally given meaning to my miserable life, while begging the gods to grant me answers to why I could not be allowed to maintain this one simple thing. When I felt a hand wrap its weathered fingers around my shoulder, I cut my moistened eyes up to meet those of the elderly man who looked down at me with concern etched into his face. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," I replied, suddenly feeling shame for the spectacle I was making of myself amongst the denizens of the city. "How about you tell me anyway?" he said, holding his other hand out to assist me in getting back to my trembling feet. The genuine compassion he wore upon his face inspired me to take his hand in mine before we shared the burden of lifting me from the hardened ground beneath my knees. I staggered slightly as my head spun from the oxygen regulating my brain back to something of a default setting. But as I finally stood level with the man who'd volunteered to listen to the story of what led me to that state, I couldn't help but feel a warmth grow inside me once more. We walked together for a time, and though I would estimate the man to have likely reached his 8th decade of life on this earth, it was he who held on to me to prevent my still shivering extremities from allowing me to fall back to the concrete ground. He did not speak a word as I spilled the words from my lips, covering the entire history of my life as I have recounted it to you through these paragraphs. His compassionate expression did not waver in the slightest, even through my recollection of the sudden, world-ending catastrophe which had claimed the very existence of the woman I loved with my whole heart and tormented soul. The words he spoke after I finished my tale were not what I expected to hear. "You ain't the only one who remembers it, kid." Not only did this practically cause my heart to skip several beats, as I'd begun to convince myself that all of this madness had been a manifestation of my traumatized mind, but it also awoke something of a ray of hope within me. I just stared with wide, unblinking eyes as he continued. "Can't rightly say why there's so few that remembers these things. Hell, I can't even imagine why any of us do, for that matter. Though I'd just lost the one shining light in my life, I still felt my skin shudder. Not from the pain of what I'd lost, though that still haunts me to this day, but the fact that I may not be alone after all. It was probably 73 the first time I died. Vietnam. Still remember every second of it, too." He glared off into the distance as he spoke, wearing the same expression my weary eyes had shown me in the mirror many times before. Always assumed a landmine would be quick, for that day. Should have been paying more attention, tell you the truth. Felt my leg blow apart before the shrapnel ripped into my guts. Ain't never felt pain like that before then. Soon as what was left of me hit the ground, the lights went out. Maybe seconds later, it was like someone just cut the switch back on. His eyes were wide, while his lower lip quivered ever so slightly. He paused for a moment, both in speech and movement. He still had his hand on my back, so I stopped in place as he did. I suppose I wasn't yet ready to allow the warmth of his hand to separate from my still trembling back. It's almost difficult to explain the comfort that one simple thing brought me, as well as the kindred spirit whose company I now shared. Of course, I was still in the war when I woke back up. Nothing seemed to change, other than the fact I wasn't dead anymore. 2 more times I fell into the darkness before I finally shipped back to my home in Georgia. 1 bayonet to the chest, and a grenade I threw myself on to protect the ones I was with. Can't say which one took my Susie away from me, but it was like she'd never been born when I got back home. You lost someone too?" I asked, feeling more shock at this new revelation. "She's only the first, kid." He gave me a forced half smile, while a tear trickled from his left eye. "Why?" I asked. Why does this happen?" He just gazed into my eyes for a moment, before gesturing with a tilt of the head for me to follow him to the park bench which sat to the side of the pathway we'd been traversing. We sat beside each other while I still glared into his time-worn face, almost mesmerized by the man who appeared to have seen far more pain in life than I. He reached into the pocket inside his coat, before pulling a wrinkled cigarette pack from within. He tapped it on his leg a few times before unwinding the transparent plastic seal from the top. He flicked the bottom of the pack with his fingers, ejecting the tip of 3 tan-colored filters to varying heights. He pulled the one protruding furthest from the others before slipping it between his lips. It was doubtlessly a dance his hands had performed countless times over the passage of the decades, as his absent eyes gazed into the night sky, while his muscle memory took control of the task. As a small flame ignited from the tip of the wooden match to light the far end of the cigarette to a soft orange glow, I felt tension course through my bones as my mind flashed back to the solar flare which had scorched the earth only weeks before. The stranger inhaled deeply before allowing the thick plume to drift out into the light wind. He glanced towards me, giving me a far more natural and sincere smile from the last. "Yeah, I remember the fire too, kid." I allowed fresh tears to stream from my eyes again as we looked upon one another. Clearly he could relate to the burdens I'd carried for so long, and that alone brought me a peace I'd not yet known. Suppose I got lucky this time. Soon as I saw the sky light up, I looked at my Bessie, sure this was the last time I was going to see her. Felt my whole body smile when I woke up next to her after the lights came back on. He wrapped his arm around me. I allowed him to pull me closer, to rest my weary head on his shoulder for a time. "I'm sorry, so sorry yours wasn't waiting here for you, kid. Been there myself more times than I can rightly say." "What's the point of existence if we can't hold on to what we love?" I said, my voice quivering while his jacket moistened from the steady flow of tears dripping from my cheek. "Well, I ain't got no choice, really. Near as I can figure, this is just the way things work." "So, we're meant to endure this?" I asked, feeling hopelessness grip me once more. "Can't say why some remember and others don't, but my preacher back home always said the soul was immortal. The way I see it, most folks ain't got no idea how many times they died over the course of their lives. They just wake up somewhere new, with memories that came with it. In their mind, they ain't never been nowhere else, so they don't remember what they had before. Hell, could be most others just die the normal way, like God intended, and we're the lucky few." He chuckled, though his eyes still blankly stared out into the world before him. We sat in silence for a time, both of us reflecting on times gone by while gazing into the uncertainty of what lies ahead. Though the logic behind his words did seem a rational, if somewhat outlandish theory, I couldn't help but wonder about another aspect of this, though it took me some time to figure out the best way to phrase my question. "So, if our consciousness just transfers to another version of ourselves in a different reality?" I asked, both curious and reluctant at the same time. "Do we just keep aging?" I felt almost guilty laying this on his lap, as he was far more advanced in years than I, and I had no desire to inadvertently hurt his feelings by implying he was nearing the end of his journey, so to speak. When the laughter erupted from him, I can't say I wasn't a little surprised, though somewhat inspired to share his sudden levity. "Couldn't tell you, kid," he said, still chuckling while wiping the jovial tears from his eyes. "Maybe after the body finally gives out, maybe you get then to move on to one of them other places they talk about in the books. Could be we all got a timer we gotta let run out before we can really see what comes after." Once more we sat quietly, sharing the light breeze the night air cast upon us. I can't even know how long we sat on that bench, just staring out across the world, which was slowly falling to rest. As the lights from the buildings and homes went dark around us, the man clapped his hand upon my leg. "I better get going, kid. My Bessie gonna get herself in a fluster if I stay gone much longer." As he lifted himself to his feet, he gave a slight moan in conjunction with the popping and creaking of the bones in his legs and back. He looked out to the path ahead, which I assumed would lead him back to his home. Before he started to saunter away from me, he began to speak one last time without turning to face me. "I can't say why, but birds always know when the end's coming." I just stared at the thin white hair across the back of his head, softly blowing in the subtle wind. "You see him cluster and make for the west. Ain't long after that." He barely moved as he spoke those final words to me. It almost felt as though he was only vaguely aware he was sharing these thoughts with me. "I'll be 87 this time next week. I've seen the world end a total of 3 times over those years. And the birds always do the same thing. Don't know how they know it's coming, but they always do." He finally turned back to face me, with a somewhat friendly smile, but a certain melancholy behind his eyes. "Take care of yourself, kid. See you on the other side." With that, he gave me a wink before strolling away from me, to be swallowed by the darkness surrounding the bench upon which I still sat. Though I never got the old man's name, nor laid eyes on him again, I recognized his picture in the newspaper a year or so later. The obituary read that he'd died due to the advanced cancer which had consumed his body from the inside out. I can't help but wonder if he still awakened the following day, hopefully next to his loving wife, or if he finally found what lies beyond this world and its infinite clones. Since that meeting with the elderly man, after almost careening into an abyss from which I would have surely never escaped, I chose to make an effort to not only endure this endless life, but to perhaps enjoy it for what it is. Though I may never again find my beloved Eleanor, I did begin seeing someone new. Kathleen is a truly incredible woman, and though I cherish each and every moment we spend together, I will not allow our relationship to advance as its predecessor did. Though my future is far more uncertain than most, I'll never allow myself to entertain the notion that anything can last. As I finally come to the end of my tale, though my life has had more than its share of very personal horrors, I would imagine mine would not necessarily fall under that category. Regardless of which genre is more suited to the story, you may still find it a little too far-fetched to believe to have taken place. I do appreciate you accompanying me on this journey through my history. Perhaps you'll still see these words as little more than the ramblings of a disturbed mind. Of course, I cannot deny that they may very well be, but I would ask you to take one small piece of advice from this. Look to the skies from time to time. In recent weeks, I've noticed the birds forming unusual groupings. It may simply be that time of year during which they feel the urge to migrate, but it could be something else entirely. Though there may be dark times ahead, fear not, my friends. Likely you will not remember a thing.
The residents of Darktown called it the perfect family diner. Cheap barbecue, smiling mascots, and free ice cream for kids. But after one employee took a job there to make ends meet, they discovered a secret so horrifying it turned their love of meat into nausea. One late-night shift, something faint but unsettling broke the monotony of washing dishes. What they found behind the diner's cheerful facade was worse than their darkest nightmares. Enough to haunt them forever. If you've got the stomach for it, we can uncover the terrifying truth behind the smiling pig at Mr. Pigsley's.
Fresh Meat by Corpse Child. You know, I used to laugh at the idea of being a vegetarian. The idea of purposefully not eating meat used to sound so dumb to me. I mean, yeah, healthy lifestyle and all. And yes, I am aware that some people actually can't eat meat because of an inability to digest it. But come on. How could you say no to a nice full rack of baby back ribs or a quarter-pounder New York-style steak, right? Well, guess the joke's on me now. After what happened, I can't think of any of that without wanting to puke. I'm going to put this out there now. If you're faint of heart or weak of stomach, do not read this. Let me also go ahead and say that no, I'm not talking about Mickey D's either. Say what you want about their food not being actual meat or whatever. I can guarantee you, whatever it is made of, it's far less horrific than what I saw at a place I used to work at. Mr. Pigsley's Diner, home of delicious meat, happy bellies, and having a snorting good time. Those words, the big, bold, red words plastered next to that smiling, fat-ass pig with a 50s-style football jacket and haircut, will always haunt my nightmares. The place itself was one of those that was made to resemble an old-timey diner from the 50s and 60s. Black and white tiled floor, vintage photos from car shows, old stuntmen or shots of Elvis Presley, as well as different antiques on display. The place even had an actual jukebox, coin-operated with actual CDs instead of the touch-screen ones you see nowadays. In the middle of the dining area was where the bar was. During the day, till about 6 or so, it was a nice cream bar, with the barley sodas being brought out later on in the evenings. Remember how you could bring your kid up to the bar on a Friday afternoon for a little oinkers hour, where the ice cream was handmade right in front of them, and they got whatever flavor and toppings they wanted, and however much of it they wanted for free. Aside from this, they also had the Piglet Wall of Fame, where the Rugrats would have pictures taken of them in little pig masks with the mascot, Mr. Pigsley, standing beside them as they scoffed down a 3-ounce plate of pulled pork. Well, of course, the kids loved it. And the parents loved it too for how dirt cheap the food was. Now we're talking $15 tops for a large-sized barbecue plate with 2 large sides with a drink. I say all of this to say that the place was very family-oriented, well, particularly when it came to bringing the kids. My family actually used to take me and my brother Andre when we were little kids, and, like I said, with all the other kids, we too had more than our fair share of our little oinker hours on Fridays to kick off the weekend, and had our pictures added to the Wall of Fame, which are all gone now after what happened. Now, take that and fast forward to almost a year ago. I'm 21 and having just moved out of my parents' house with no degree or any other job experience, and I needed to have a way to make rent for my apartment. And you can imagine how difficult a decision it was for me to choose Mr. Pigsley's Diner as my go-to. I was hired almost on the spot, after I put in an application to be a cook. Well, the pay for the job I'd be doing admittedly wasn't quite as bad as I was expecting. $11 an hour, 40 hours a week. Of course, being that it was strictly second shift, this meant long, exhausting nights slaving in the kitchen, and then closing the kitchen. It was rough, but I had to do it. And after about a month or two, I'd just about gotten used to it. Actually, it wasn't long after that I was getting my first raise, to $11.75. I'd also managed to get to a point, usually because the other kitchen staff were out back taking a smoke, that I was actually able to handle working most areas of the kitchen alone. In other words, I'd gotten pretty good at my job pretty quickly. One of my duties, unfortunately, was washing any remaining dishes at night when we closed. It sucked, mostly because of the fact that it was always the grill utensils and shit that I got stuck washing. You know, the shit that would be the dirtiest. And we had to wait until we were closed for the night to wash them. Because of this, and because the shift manager, Trish, usually dragged her feet with her part, making sure everything is done right, as well as the fact that closing shifts only had 2 people around to shut the place down for the night, we weren't usually getting out of there until about 1 or 1:30 in the morning every night. Well, it was because of this that things would take a weird turn. Funny enough, I almost didn't even notice it. It was a Friday night, which of course meant we'd been slammed all day with business, and I was beyond tired and ready to be done with the place for the night. I was in the sink room, located a little ways behind the kitchen and grill area, next to the freezer and dry stock, washing the dishes, as best I could anyway, while Trish finished up with the money. Since my phone was dead, I couldn't listen to music or podcasts while I washed the dishes, like I usually did. And that's when I heard it. It was very faint, and again, I almost didn't hear it. It almost sounded like a faint groaning noise. But being exhausted and figuring that it was just the electrical hum of the freezer, I shook it off and continued. It was when I was just about finished with the dishes, though, that I heard it again. Louder this time. Listening a little harder, I noticed that it was indeed coming from the freezer. I pressed my ear to the door, and I could hear it much louder now. Concentrating, I thought I could hear the sounds of muffled sobbing from inside. I tried pulling the handle to open the freezer door, only to find it locked. Weird, I thought. Why is the freezer locked? I was never told before that the freezer was supposed to be locked at night. Maybe it's to keep the meat fresh, keep everything cold. This didn't make much sense to me, but I ended up having to just go with it when I heard Trish calling for me, telling me she was ready to go home. I pretty much immediately forgot all about it until the next night, closing the kitchen when I heard it again. Like last time, the freezer door was locked, and inside I could hear a very faint sound like someone groaning. It was louder this time, a lot louder. I also noticed this time that it seemed like it would randomly let out sharp bursts of crying or wailing. At one point I thought I could hear a shrill sort of screaming noise as well. What the... Started knocking on the freezer door. Hello, hey, is someone in there? Nothing. The only response was the continued groaning noises from the other side. I tried knocking again. Hey, what's going on? I spun around to see Trish standing behind me, looking confused. What the hell are you doing? Have you finished yet? Yeah. I looked at the freezer. Hey, is there any particular reason the freezer's locked? She cocked her eyebrow. What do you mean? I pulled the handle to demonstrate. Her eyes continued looking confused as she then tried to open it herself, with the same result. She said, resigning. That is weird. No, I don't know why the heck they'd have it like this. What's got you so worried about it, though? Well, I thought I could hear something, or somebody in there. What do you mean? She asked, looking even more confused now. I shrugged and chuckled nervously. I don't know, I just kept hearing these weird noises coming from in there. I pressed my ear to the door again, still hearing that faint groaning sound. Hey, do you hear it? Well, still looking skeptical, she then pressed her ear to the door. She stayed like this for a moment before shaking her head. Sounds the same it always has. At least, same as it has since I've been here. Well, this is an old place, though. The wiring in there must be on the fritz. You sure? I asked, cocking my own eyebrows in confusion. Because it sounds like someone's in there. Oh yeah, besides which, we can't get in anyways. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of like to get out of here and go home before it's time to open the place back up. She held up her phone, reading almost 1:45 a.m. With that, I gave one last look at the freezer before turning and following Trish. But that night, I couldn't shrug it off like I'd done before. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop imagining something or someone in the freezer. Moreover, I couldn't stop wondering about what that sound was. Now, obviously, I wasn't buying the whole, just the old 40 wiring crap. What the hell were they doing in there? Well, as it happened, the next day was when the owner, Mr. Pigsley, would be in for one of his little routine visits. He'd usually come round once or twice a month, unannounced, and just sort of check in, make sure everyone's doing everything that needs to get done. Basically a sort of general inspection, One thing I noticed too was that one of the first things he always did was to check out the freezer. Naturally, I figured if anything was going on in there, he'd know, right? As well as this, we were actually slow, for the first time that week, by the way, which made it relatively easy for me to ask him about it first thing when he came in. What do you mean? He asked me, cocking his eyebrow like Trish did. Well, the past 2 nights, sir, I've been hearing these weird noises coming from the freezer. Whenever I try to go check it out, though, it's always locked. Is it supposed to be? He frowned. What sort of noises? I don't really know, sir, I replied, admittedly feeling a bit awkward. It sounds like someone's in there. And he stared, frowning at me for a moment before opening the freezer and walking inside. I followed him. Inside, of course, I heard the droning of the refrigeration systems. In other words, the normal sounds it should have been making in there. And there were boxes labelled fresh meat stacked against the walls. Everything was there just the way it was supposed to be. No weird sounds, nobody else in the freezer, aside from me and Mr. Pigsley. Well, he said, turning back to me, I don't hear nothing. Well, he looked back inside for a moment before saying, Okay, nothing except for the fridge wires on their last legs. I reckon I'll have to get that looked at, won't I? He chuckled when he said this, before then saying, Hey, thanks for letting me know. I stood for a moment, confused, before stammering, Yes, sir, sure thing. I then felt the hand of Andy, one of the other grill hands, tap me on the shoulder, telling me I was needed back in the kitchen. Mr. Pigsley waved his hand dismissively before turning and going back into the freezer. Fridge wires on their last legs? I couldn't take my mind off of how wrong that sounded to me. For one thing, the fridge actually sounded normal. Plus, after taking a peek at the thermostat outside, I saw that, well, at least according to the reading at the time, it was working just fine. Secondly, this didn't make sense to me because, if they really were on their last legs, shouldn't he have known that and done something long before now? On top of all that, though, was the fact that the big question wasn't even answered. Why the hell was the freezer door locked? Not only this, how was it locked? There were no bolts or anything on the handle, inside or out. As much as I wanted to shove all of this at Mr. Pigsley until I got an answer, I wouldn't get the opportunity again before he left. That night I wasn't the one to close the kitchen, having agreed to switch shifts with Andy so he could get a few more hours in. For some reason he was only scheduled 2 days that week for 5 hours each. So this meant I was getting off that night at around 10 p.m. Because I was still skeptical, or should I say suspicious, about the whole freezer thing, I asked him, as part of the agreement, if he'd keep an eye on the freezer and tell me if he noticed anything off about it. He agreed. I could tell he thought I was nuts. And so 10 o'clock rolled around. I was punching the clock, but not before checking the freezer one last time. It was unlocked and full of nothing but frozen food. I was heading out back to my car when I heard a rustling sound coming from the dumpster. Looking over, I could see the lid pushing up, like something was trying to get out. I was about to brush it off as probably just raccoons or maybe a couple of stray cats, when I heard what sounded like snorting. What the f... I was cut off when I then heard a high-pitched squealing noise that almost seemed to echo in the empty parking lot. This caused my heart to skip about 3 or 4 beats, and I had to close my eyes and cover my ears tight. This was followed by several loud banging noises coming from inside the dumpster. I watched this continue, jaw slacked, frozen in shock, until the lid of the dumpster suddenly flew open. For a brief moment, I saw what looked like 2 pig ears slowly emerge from the dumpster, followed by 2 dark, empty, marble-looking eyes glinting into the streetlights. That was when I took off like a bat out of hell and bolted back around to the front of the diner and ran inside. "Hey, guys," I shouted, crashing through the front doors. They immediately looked at me, wide-eyed and startled. I struggled to speak, being out of breath. There's something out there." "Where?" Andy asked. I pointed to the back and said, breathless, "At the dumpster." His face immediately fell into one that said, "Oh, you're shitting me here, right?" I caught my breath as Trish asked what it was exactly that I'd seen. I began, remembering those 2 black beady eyes glaring at me. "I think it was a pig." "A pig?" Trish asked, her voice completely bewildered now. Andy stared at me for a second before scoffing. "Dude," he said, sounding like he was 2 seconds from busting his gut, laughing in my face. "Whatever shit you're on." "I'm serious," I shouted, cutting him off. He just kept looking at me like I was crazy while Trish looked lost. I saw 2 pig eyes staring at me from the dumpster. I heard it squealing too. "Where the hell could it have come from?" Trish asked. "I mean, there's no farm around here." Andy snickered and remarked, "Oh, maybe the last truck had one that wasn't quite ready yet." Oh, Trish snickered at this too. I was the only one, though, who wasn't finding this funny. "Oh, damn it, Andy. I'm not screwing around here. I saw a giant pig staring at me in the dumpster." But he just snickered again. "Ah, it was a giant pig." He then made a surprised face and turned to Trish, saying, "Hear that, Trish? A mean old monster pig is going to get us, eh? Oh!" I curled my hand into a fist, clenching my teeth. I was getting really agitated really quickly. Before I could do or say anything, though, I heard something coming from the back behind the kitchen, near the freezer. "What?" Trish asked, noticing my attention towards the back of the diner. I shushed her before starting towards the freezer. "Listen," I whispered. It sounded like something big was dragging its feet across the floor. "You hear that?" I watched Trish and Andy cup their ears. Listening closer, I could also hear the sound of someone's muffled bawling in the distance, sounding like their mouth was covered or taped over. I watched as Trish seemed to take notice. "What the hell is that?" she asked, turning now to look towards the back like I was. Andy just looked at the both of us, confused. "Now you two, Trish. What are you guys going on?" He stopped when he heard the sound of the freezer door opening. Now his eyes were wide. "What the fuck? Who's back there?" We heard the freezer door shut, still hearing the muffled screaming from behind. Andy started towards the back when I shot out my hand, stopping him. "Wait. What if it's some maniac with a gun or something?" And he just pushed past me towards the back. I followed after him, with Trish joining behind me. The sounds from the freezer were louder now, shrill, like someone was being tortured. I could hear what sounded like a young girl, high school age, screaming, "No, please don't, let me go." These were followed by sharp cries of pain that caused the three of us to have to cover our ears. As we were doing this, the sounds, both of screaming and the weird squealing, were getting louder and louder. I began imagining the thing on the other side to be some sort of mutant behemoth pig monster, like Andy had said, with huge muscular arms and gigantic tusks that impaled me like a kebab. Finally, Andy ran and got the emergency fire extinguisher and used it to batter the door until we heard something fall to the ground, crashing on the other side before shoving the door open. In front of the door was a bunch of the fresh meat boxes that had apparently been propped against the door to keep it shut. Now knocked over onto the floor of the freezer, I saw a few of them had broken open, scattering red, meaty, bloody chunks all across the floor of the freezer. Just for a brief second, I looked closely at a pile of the stuff, and that was all it took to make me start to retch. There, spilling out of the box, was what looked to be a large intestine, coiling out from the severed legs of what looked to be a small child, possibly even an infant. Almost on cue, the smell of a dead body flooded my nose instantly, further causing my stomach to turn over on itself. I wasn't the only one struggling to keep from spilling their stomach either, after seeing this. Andy had to cover his mouth and turn away. To her credit, funnily enough, given how she always claimed to hate scary movies in the past when I talked about them, Trish was the only one who wasn't affected by this, at least not as much as me and Andy. She took the lead and went inside. It took another second of pulling ourselves together before me and Andy could follow her, though. Inside, we could all hear the sounds of screaming and pigs squealing from the far end of the freezer. Slowly, the three of us made our way towards the back, towards this sound. Despite what I said earlier about Trish being the most strong-stomached out of the three of us, what she saw next made her vomit right there in the freezer where she stood. There, in the middle of the floor, was a young girl. Couldn't have been a day over 17. Pinned to the floor, naked, and on top of her was a giant, hairy, overweight gorilla of a man, wearing what looked like one of those pig's masks you'd see from Party City on Halloween. The pigman stopped, as he must have heard Trish, and reared up from the girl before turning to look at us. For a second, we all just stood there, me and Trish both speechless with horror, while Andy was the first to speak. "Who are you? What the fuck are you doing?" Whatever, just stood snorting angrily, like he was rearing up to charge at Andy. Trish ran over to try and help the girl, when she was snatched by the throat and hurled into a stack of meat boxes behind her. I ran to help her up, while Andy charged towards the pigman. Just like Trish, Andy was caught by the throat before being forced to the ground. After helping Trish up, she ran over to help the girl, while I tried to help Andy. The pigman had him on the ground, crushing his throat and pressing one knee on his chest, crushing his ribs. And without thinking, I hurled myself at him, shoving him off of Andy and into the wall to the right of us. Andy was wheezing and gasping for air as I helped him to his feet, while Trish rushed her and the girl out of the freezer. "Call the police," I shouted to her as she ran out. When I looked to where the pigman had landed, I saw that the mask had fallen off. Now, against the wall, buck-ass naked, was Mr. Pigsley. What the... Before I could even finish that thought, he looked up at me, glaring, before letting out a deafening squeal and charging at me. In less than a few seconds, he was on top of me, ravenously trying to bite at my face like a rabid dog. I tried pushing his face away, which resulted in 3 of my fingers getting bitten, hard enough to start bleeding and go numb. Andy tried wrestling him off of me by getting him in a chokehold, only to be met by a backhand that sent him into the wall again. Now he was crushing my throat like he had been with Andy. My vision started blurring when, the next thing I knew, I felt Mr. Pigsley's hand release my throat, causing me to grasp for air. Mr. Pigsley was on the ground, staring up at the ceiling, dazed, with Andy holding one of the boxes that he'd used to bash him over the head with. "Hey, you okay?" he asked. Yeah, I groaned, pain still shooting through my hand. I could hear Mr. Pigsley groan as he stirred on the floor. I told Andy to stay there and make sure he didn't go anywhere while I went to check up on Trish. Sure enough, Trish and the girl were out front, talking to a couple of police officers. I joined them and they asked me where he was. I led them back to the freezer where Mr. Pigsley was still writhing on the floor. The officers then took over, leading us back out to the front. By that time, the parking lot was filled with police cars and an ambulance. After having them checked out by the ambulance, the other officers escorted Andy, Trish, and the girl home while I was checked out for my hand. I actually had to be taken to the hospital for it to get stitches. I read a few days after that, upon looking into the contents of the freezer, the mutilated remains of infants, as well as several teenagers, had been found with evidence that they were being ground up and processed using the meat grinder next to the dry stock area in the back. Mr. Pigsley was arrested and tried for kidnapping, as they were unable to link him to any of the human remains at the time. He claimed, though, that he had absolutely no idea what was going on, that apparently he was at his house one moment and then lying naked in the freezer the next. In the end, he was sentenced to 3.5 years in a psychiatric facility. The diner was closed down and condemned after that, and a month later, it was cleared out and bulldozed, and is now serving as a vacant parking lot. I lost all contact with Trish and Andy, as well as anyone else from Mr. Pigsley's diner, soon after that night, and got a new job as a sales associate at a thrift store, where I work nowadays. Oh, the pay isn't as much, and the hours are long, sure, but my co-workers are pretty cool. Plus, at least I don't have to work around food anymore. Well, it was sometime last week that I was scrolling around online, just screwing around on my break at work, when I found old articles about local sightings of the Pigman. I clicked on them and read about multiple reports of people, namely teens and or small children, going missing in the dead of night in the town located just next to mine. Each time a few witnesses would claim to see a giant creature with the head of a pig and the body of a man lurking around. Of course, these were usually the tinfoil hat types making these claims, so it didn't surprise me that these claims weren't exactly taken seriously by authorities at the time. That said, they never found any suspects, nor were the missing persons ever found. But the worst part, the thing that's driven me now to have constant nightmares, was when I looked at the dates of the reports. They were all dated in the early 50s, right around the time that the diner had first opened its doors. All that time, I, as well as God knows how many others, had been eating children. What's even worse is that for almost a year, I was the one that had cooked it and served it to people. This is why I've decided 2 things. First, I will never work in another food establishment again. No exceptions. And the second is that I'm strictly a vegetarian. It was admittedly a bit hard at first. Like I said, how could you pass up a nice juicy prime rib? But any time I thought about meat of any kind, well, I can't help but remember what I saw in the freezer that night.
When a struggling tenant moved into one of Darktown's shadier apartments, they were greeted by an eerie tradition. Mysterious meal boxes left at their door every day. The rule was simple but bizarre. Prepare the food, eat half, and toss the rest. No questions, no exceptions. Well, after weeks of compliance, hunger and frustration drove this person to break the rules. Nothing happened at first. But when the darkness lurking in the shadows made itself known, they realized the cost of defiance could be deadly. What's the real reason behind the boxes, and what happens when you stop following the rules?
Down the Drain by L.M. Shale. after sprinkling parmesan over the mouth-watering chicken and spinach tortellini I just made. I scraped half the dish into the sink and turned on the garbage disposal with an irritated sigh. I hated having to throw half of it away each time. The only reason I moved into this apartment was because rent was cheaper after I'd lost my job and nearly burned through my meagre savings. It definitely wasn't the suffocating ambience and sketchy neighborhood, and it most certainly wasn't the meal prep boxes left daily at my door. I only learned about those when the previous tenant visited me. Lida dropped by the very same day I moved in. After pointing out the leaky corners I should avoid, suggesting affordable roach traps, and teaching me how to lock the window with a broomstick, she mentioned the boxes. I thought she was kidding, but she was dead serious. I had to prepare dinner each day, dump half in the garbage disposal, and eat the rest right away. She seemed so nonchalant about it, but I wasn't. Who was sending them? Why? What would happen if I refused? Well, she had no solid answers. All she knew was what the previous tenant had told her, which is what they were told by the previous tenant, and so on. Origins unknown. Even the landlord had no idea that this was going on, and Lida stressed that I must never tell him. She also stressed that I must never refuse. Why? Well, she said protection, claiming that for as long as she'd lived there, the apartment was never robbed. Was she seriously insinuating that this stupid requirement protected her? Well, she shrugged and said anything was possible. She didn't question the absurdity of it all, but she did question my reluctance. She assured me that she'd eaten from the boxes every day for the year she'd lived here, and they were legit. No prank, no poison, no strings attached. Just dump half in the garbage disposal and eat the rest right away. She began listing the various meals she'd prepared, and my empty stomach growled. I hadn't had a decent meal in days, and it didn't take me long before I caved. Now, after a month of delicious food, my unease had ebbed, but not my disdain. After I turned off the garbage disposal, I grabbed the remaining chicken and spinach tortellini and plopped down on the floor, eating my only meal today. Despite licking the plate clean, my stomach still complained, and I glared at the sink. Half a portion wasn't enough, and I was sick of wasting part of a perfectly good meal, one that I'd worked hard on, no less. I was done following these ridiculous rules. Tomorrow, I was going to eat the entire thing. And I did. For the next week, I prepared and ate the whole meal, and nothing happened. Well, I'll admit, I was nervous the first few days, but when the world didn't collapse and the boxes kept coming, I felt pretty clever for being the first to break this ridiculous and wasteful trend. As long as the food kept getting delivered right to my door, I was going to eat it. All of it. 8 days later, I realized my actions could have killed me. My bladder woke me up that night, and I shambled to the bathroom. After washing my hands, I made my way back to the sleeping bag, and I frowned at an unusual draft. Before I could figure out where it was coming from, a startling force knocked me to the ground. My heart leapt to my throat, and it probably would have jumped out of my mouth if there wasn't a hand smothering my scream. The stench of sweat filled my lungs as I struggled beneath a bony weight, my panicked thoughts flashing terrifying scenarios through my mind. A sharp hiss for silence pierced my ear as the cold metal of a gun pressed against my temple, and I abided. Trembling face down on the floor, I held my breath, my eyes wide in fearful anticipation as I heard my attacker grunting and rummaging. I turned my gaze to the open window, and I cursed myself for not propping the broomstick properly as I saw it lying on the floor. In no time, the intruder had shoved a filthy rag in my mouth and yanked my arms behind my back, binding them before he lashed my ankles together. Only then did he take his weight off me and flip me over, his sunken eyes wild under a mess of hair. He was definitely on something, and it was frightening. His actions had no hesitation. He came here for something, and he wasn't leaving without it. The question was, what? That mystery didn't last long, as he demanded to know where I hid my valuables. I stared at him in disbelief. Did he not see the squalor I was living in? I didn't even have furniture. Did he think I had cash stuffed in my frayed sleeping bag, gold hidden in the rusty oven, diamonds stashed behind the broken radiator? My baffled silence wasn't the answer he was looking for, and I cried out as he punched me in the face. He lifted his fist again, and I flinched, whimpering through my gag as I nodded towards my meager possessions, my wallet and my phone. He crawled over to them, and I crawled away, tears stinging my eyes as my cheek throbbed to the rhythm of my stuttering heart. I was certain that $11.25 and a phone with a cracked screen wouldn't be enough to appease him. He seemed desperate enough to kill. I had to save myself before it was too late. As he tore through my wallet in frustration, I made my way to the kitchen, my eyes on the drawers. I just needed a knife to cut through these bonds, and I could make a run for it. Balancing on my knees, I bent over and reached up with my hands, my trembling fingers searching for the handle. Gripping it, I pulled, but it didn't move. This was the worst time for it to stick. I wiggled it, as I always do, but my position was less than optimal, and the drawer refused to budge. After a particularly forceful yank, I lost my balance and fell with a grunt, and my terrified eyes turned towards the door as the intruder stomped in, gun aimed at me. I screamed and cowered against the cupboards, my heart slamming against my ribcage as the blood drained from my face. And then the blood drained from his face. I followed his petrified gaze, and I screamed even louder as an unholy creature erupted from the sink. It towered over us like a giant furry centipede, pointy legs bristling from its long, inky body and spikes jutting out of its mouth. With a lurching motion, looking almost as though it was falling, it descended upon the intruder, silencing his scream with a stab straight through his throat. It didn't silence my screams, though, and I continued to shriek through my gag as the monster continued to stab the man, its sharp legs jabbing at him like a macabre typewriter. It was facing away, but that didn't stop the spraying blood from dotting every surface of the kitchen, including me. After a final few jabs, the monster stopped puncturing the intruder, and I watched in horror as it began sliding the mutilated body into its mouth, its legs tapping against the cracked tiles with excitement, as though this was its first meal in ages. It devoured its kill the way a snake would, completely whole, and vomit fought my screams as it burned my throat. Once the last of the man disappeared, the creature gulped a few times and began spasming. For a hopeful moment I thought it was choking and dying, but to my terrified dismay, I realized it was crushing the body within its own as I heard bones snap and grind. Its convulsing stopped, and shock stole my screams as I watched its sharp legs retract into its blood-soaked fur. It now looked more like a giant fluffy caterpillar than a centipede, and my raspy breaths raced my pulse as I fearfully waited to see what it would do next. I stared in fraught disbelief as the monster began slithering across the floor, lapping up every drop of blood it came across before it stretched itself to reach the counters, walls, and ceiling. It was a lot more coordinated after eating, and that amplified my unease. Soon only my corner was left, and it turned to me, giving me my first clear view of its face. It wasn't what I expected. I'd imagined pincers, antennas, and compound eyes, but instead I saw a rounded snout, floppy ears, and deep scars where its eyes should be. In any other scenario, it might pass for cute, but right now all it did was reboot my vocal cords as it slithered closer. My muffled screams echoed as I pressed myself against the cupboards, petrified, but it didn't seem to care as it licked up the blood around me. When it began licking me, my heart almost stopped beating right then and there, as I was certain I was next on the menu. And then, it nuzzled me. I peeked through my eyelids, gulping, and I frowned in uneasy confusion as it curled up beside me, laying its large head on my lap. Slowly I allowed my screams to stop, my tense body quivering with adrenaline. It had murdered my attacker, cleaned up the crime scene, and now was snuggling. A knock on the door startled us as my neighbours asked if I was all right, and I gasped, afraid the monster would go after them. But to my surprise, it shrank away instead, slithering towards the sink and stretching itself thin before wiggling down the drain. The door crashed open and my neighbours ran in, the look on their faces matching mine as they saw me bound in the corner, quaking with shock. After they freed me and I found my voice, I mentioned the robber, but I gave him a happier ending as I claimed he'd run away. As much as the creature terrified me, it had saved my life, and I didn't want it to get in trouble. Besides, who'd believe me? Oh, maybe Leda would. I decided to call her in the morning, but that left me up all night thinking. Was that creature the thing that we'd been feeding all this time? Was Leda right? Was it here to protect us? Was it too weak to scare off the robber before he attacked me because I'd unintentionally starved it for over a week? And despite all that, did it care for me that much that it didn't eat me, saved my life, and snuggled? I hope that was the case. The creature didn't seem malevolent towards me, but there were still many unanswered questions and uncertainties, and I hoped Leda could answer them. But she couldn't. I didn't mention the monster right away, afraid she'd be clueless and think I was insane. Instead, I asked if she knew what was protecting us and if anything unusual slithered out of the kitchen sink. She said how daily ritual protected us, a modern version of ancient sacrifices to the gods. And then she suggested I ask the landlord to fix my pest issues. I still had no answers. Too poor to leave the apartment and not willing to tempt fate, I decided to continue dumping half the meal in the garbage disposal. If that creature was going to protect me, I had to stay on its good side. The next day, I carried the box to the kitchen, pinned the recipe to my fridge, and began preparing a spicy salmon pizza, keeping a wary eye on the sink. As I turned to the recipe, running my finger down the instructions, it slipped from beneath the magnet and fell to the floor. This happened every once in a while, but this time, the glossy paper disappeared beneath the fridge. Not willing to stick my hand under there, I grabbed a wire coat hanger, stretched it out, and began fishing. I recovered a medley of cereal crumbs, a fossilized chicken wing, a pen cap, a used car salesman's business card, 2 dead roaches, my recipe, and a strange yellowed paper. Curious, I dusted it off and read it, my eyes expanding with every word. December 11th, 2013. Dear Tenant, I moved into this apartment to care for my savior. I was a hunter, you see, and I had terminal cancer. I was reckless, and I didn't care when death would choose to take me. But Alesta cared. She protected me when I challenged a bear, appearing out of the blue and nearly dying herself. No one had ever done for me what she did, and I was moved by her selflessness. Alesta got injured and lost her eyesight. She was no longer able to hunt, and I felt responsible. I invited her to live with me. With the last of my savings, I signed up for 10 years of a meal prep program. I know I won't live that long. She may not either, but I still ask you, dear tenant, to continue honoring her. Every evening, prepare the meal and leave it in the cupboard under the sink. Then, go to sleep. The next morning, if the plate is still full, do with it as you wish. If the plate is empty, don't be alarmed. Just continue to honor my savior, and you'll be safe and secure as long as you live here. Dear tenant, this is all I ask of you, fulfilling a grateful man's dying wish. Please don't mention this to anyone, especially not the landlord, but if you end up moving out, please hand this letter to the new tenant. And when the 10 years are up on December 11th, 2023, please, my friend, consider renewing. Alesta deserves it. Thank you and be blessed, Callum. I put the letter down, stunned. The creature truly was a protector. Alesta. brought here to be cared for by a man with a little time. Callum put a lot of faith in a bunch of strangers, but I guess he didn't have a choice. He could have at least told us what we were dealing with, but maybe he didn't trust we'd have Alester's best interests at heart. I was surprised we'd all followed the rule despite how cryptic it was, well, at least until I came along. I looked at the letter again. Would I have been more inclined to abide if I'd received this? I'll never know, because one of the previous tenants misplaced it and passed on the message verbally, the request changing from person to person like a game of telephone, until we were feeding Alester half her intended meal through the garbage disposal. Well, that wasn't going to happen anymore. And I didn't want Alester to hide anymore either. She'd saved my life, and I wanted to improve hers. After preparing the spicy salmon pizza, I placed it on the kitchen floor and sat cross-legged in front of it. Working up the courage, I cleared my throat and called out her name. Alester? A soft gurgle sounded from the drain. Alester, dinner, food, yummy food. I'd never met a creature like Alester before, and I had no idea how intelligent she was. Come out. It's okay. You don't have to eat in the drain anymore. You can live out here with me. I held my breath as she poked her head out of the sink, her nose sniffing the air. Hey, Alester. She gurgled again. She seemed to like hearing her name. The one her only friend had given her. Well, now, she has another friend. I gestured to the pizza and smiled before I remembered she couldn't see. This pizza is all for you. I looked down with regret. I'm sorry I didn't feed you last week. I'll never do that again. I couldn't help but tense up as she slithered over, her long, slender body compressing into a bulbous form as she settled in front of me. This was going to take some getting used to. She smelled like rust and old lettuce, and I hoped she wasn't averse to baths now that she didn't have to hide anymore. Two pointy legs protruded from her fur, and they poked around blindly until they found the plate. I watched in surprise as she split the pizza and slid half over to me, and I pushed it back. No, it's all for you, like Callum wanted. As I said that, my stomach growled, and Alester chirped in response and slid half towards me again. She picked up a slice and began nibbling, and I smiled, teary-eyed as I reached for my own slice. For the first time ever, I was glad I'd lost my job. And once I get a new one, neither of us will ever go hungry again.
Well, my dear friends, I do get a lot of positive feedback on this particular format, and it really works for me as well. It just feels more immersive. Like, instead of saying, oh, here's story 1, story 2, trying to create this universe around this mysterious dark town. I don't know, I just find it quite compelling, and I did it quite a lot a few years ago, and then I just let it slide. So a few of them recently, and you seem to be, as I said, quite happy with it. So I do want to know more, though. Let me know thoughts, feelings, anything else you want to say in the comment section below the video. And as ever, I will do my best to join in the conversation, and your feedback will be very much appreciated. Well, that is it for this Sunday evening. Something big and wonderful coming tomorrow night. So please join me again. Probably, I've got a couple of things on the boil that I'm halfway through recording. It's probably going to be another military kind of horror, creepypasta kind of thing. That doesn't help you at all, does it? Anyway. Well, I'm definitely waffling here, so any thoughts on tonight's one would be much appreciated. And of course, sleep well, my dear friends, until the next time.
Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.